Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. When I was in my early teenage years, my house became the place where my friends liked to hang out. My parents were pretty relaxed about having people over as long as we didn't cause too much trouble, so it wasn't unusual for a group of us to gather there on weekends. Sometimes we would stay up late playing video games, watching movies, or just talking about random things the way teenagers do when they're trying to stretch the night out as long as possible. One particular night stands out more clearly than the others. It started as a normal sleepover. A handful of my friends had come over, and we spent the evening doing the usual things. We ordered pizza, played some games, and joked around for hours. The house had that late-night feeling where the lights are dim. Everyone is a little tired, but not ready to go to sleep yet. And the conversations slowly start drifting into stranger topics. Eventually, someone brought up the idea of trying the Bloody Mary ritual. Almost every kid hears about it at some point growing up. The idea is simple. You stand in a dark bathroom, usually with a candle, stare into a mirror, and repeat the name Bloody Mary several times. Supposedly, if you do it correctly, some kind of spirit appears in the mirror behind you. Of course, most people don't actually believe it's real. But when you're a group of teenagers late at night, bored and looking for something exciting to do, even silly ghost stories can suddenly seem interesting. The suggestion instantly grabbed everyone's attention. People started laughing about it at first, but the idea slowly turned into a challenge. A couple of my friends insisted we should try it just to see what happened. Others pretended they weren't scared, even though you could tell everyone felt at least a little nervous about it. Eventually, we agreed to try it, but we made two important rules. First, nobody would go into the bathroom alone. Second, we would do it 2 people at a time. There were 2 reasons for this. The first reason was simple and honest. None of us were brave enough to go in alone. Even though we kept joking about how it was just a stupid game, the thought of standing in a dark bathroom by yourself, staring into a mirror in the middle of the night, was still pretty unsettling. The second reason was that we wanted witnesses. If someone went in alone and came back out claiming they had seen something terrifying, the rest of us would probably assume they were just making it up to scare everyone else. But if 2 people experienced the same thing, then at least there would be some confirmation. That logic made the whole thing feel a little more official, even though we were still just a bunch of teenagers messing around. After arguing for a few minutes about who would go first, my friend John and I ended up volunteering. At the time, we tried to act confident, like it was no big deal. Inside, though, I think both of us felt that small, nervous tension that comes with doing something creepy in the darks. The rest of our friends stayed outside in the hallway while we went into the bathroom. We turned off the overhead light so the room would be completely dark except for a single candle we placed on the sink. The small flame flickered gently, casting moving shadows across the walls and across the mirror hanging above the sink. The bathroom suddenly felt very quiet. Even though our friends were just outside the door, it felt like we had stepped into a completely different space. John and I stood side by side in front of the mirror. The candle sat between us, its reflection glowing faintly in the glass. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then we started the ritual. Bloody Mary. Our voices sounded quieter than I expected. Bloody Mary. The candle flickered again, making our reflections shift slightly. Bloody Mary. After the third time, we both fell silent. The instructions we had heard said you were supposed to wait. So we waited. Both of us stared at the mirror. The reflection showed the two of us standing there with the candlelight glowing between us. The dim light made our faces look slightly distorted, the way candlelight sometimes does. Shadows moved slowly along the walls behind us. I remember focusing hard on the mirror, scanning every corner of the reflection. Part of me expected something dramatic to happen. Maybe the light would go out. Maybe some shape would appear behind us. Maybe the mirror would fog up or crack or something equally dramatic, but nothing happened. The bathroom stayed quiet. The candle kept burning steadily. Our reflections remained exactly where they should be. After about 30 seconds, the tension started to fade. John looked over at me and shrugged slightly, like he was silently saying that the whole thing had been a waste of time. I shrugged back. For a moment, I just stared at my own reflection in the mirror. And that's when something strange caught my attention. My reflection was smiling. At first, my brain didn't process it correctly. It was such a small detail that it almost slipped past my awareness. But after another second, I realized something was wrong. I wasn't smiling. My face felt completely neutral, but the reflection looking back at me clearly was. The smile wasn't huge. It was subtle. A slow, quiet grin that didn't match the expression on my real face. I felt a sudden cold rush of fear. My heart started beating faster as I stared at the mirror, trying to understand what I was seeing. I stayed perfectly still, almost afraid to move. The reflection kept smiling. For a split second, I wondered if maybe my face had moved slightly without me realizing it. Sometimes mirrors can play tricks with lighting and shadows. But the more I focused on it, the more certain I became. The reflection's expression did not match my own. It looked like me. But the smile belonged to something else. I quickly turned my head to look at John. He was still staring into the mirror, but his face looked confused. "What?" he asked quietly. I turned back to the mirror again. The reflection had returned to normal. The smile was gone. Now it looked exactly like my real expression again. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to calm the sudden rush of adrenaline that had hit me. Maybe it had been a trick of the candlelight. Maybe my eyes had just imagined the movement. Eventually, we blew out the candle and walked back into the hallway where our friends were waiting. They immediately started asking questions. Did anything happen? Did you see anything? John laughed and shook his head. Nope, nothing. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Technically, nothing dramatic had happened. No ghost had appeared. No supernatural figure had stepped out of the mirror. But that brief moment where my reflection seemed to move on its own stayed in my mind. Even now, years later, I still remember that strange feeling. The unsettling moment when I looked at the mirror and realized that the face staring back at me wasn't doing exactly what I was doing. It might have just been a trick of shadows and imagination. But at the time, standing in that dim, candlelit bathroom with a group of friends waiting outside the door, it was one of the creepiest moments I had ever experienced. When my parents were younger, before they had kids and before life became busy with work and responsibilities, they took a short trip to Baltimore to visit some friends. It was meant to be a simple visit, just a few days away to spend time catching up with people they hadn't seen in a while. They didn't stay in a hotel. Instead, they were offered a place to stay by a family friend who owned a house in the area but was out of town at the time. The arrangement seemed easy enough. The owners told them they could use the house while they were visiting the city, and my parents thought it would be more comfortable than staying somewhere unfamiliar. At the time, it sounded like a good idea. But from the moment they arrived, something about the place felt wrong. When they first pulled up to the house, they noticed it was completely dark. At first they thought maybe they had arrived later than expected, and the neighborhood had just grown quiet for the night. But when they went inside, they realized the electricity in the house was turned off. None of the lights worked. My dad checked a few switches and outlets, but nothing responded. Eventually, he figured the power must have been shut off at the breaker. The breaker box was in the basement, so my dad grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. The basement was unfinished, the kind you often find in older houses built many decades ago. The floor was bare concrete, the ceiling beams were exposed, and the walls were rough and plain. There were a few old pipes running along the ceiling and corners, and the air down there smelled slightly damp, like old wood and cold stone. As soon as my dad reached the bottom of the stairs, he said he got a strange feeling. Not the kind of feeling you get from being scared by something obvious. It was more like a quiet sense that something about the place wasn't right. The basement felt heavy and uncomfortable, like the air itself carried a kind of tension. He didn't see anything unusual, but the atmosphere alone made him uneasy. He walked over to the breaker panel, flipped the switches back on, and watched as the lights in the house above flickered back to life. The moment he finished, he turned around and went straight back upstairs. When he reached the top of the basement steps, he shut the door behind him and locked it. He didn't say much about it at the time, but the basement had given him a bad feeling he couldn't quite explain. At first, my mom assumed it was just the usual creepiness of an old house. Many older homes have unfinished basements that feel unsettling at night. But during the next couple of days, strange things started happening. Small things at first. Things that were easy to dismiss. For example, the window shades in the house sometimes rolled up on their own. My parents would lower them before going to bed, but later they would notice one or two of them slowly rising by themselves. At first, my dad blamed old springs in the shades. Then there were the phone calls. The house had an old landline phone sitting on a small table near the living room. Occasionally, it would ring late at night. When my parents answered, they didn't hear anyone speaking. Instead, there were faint sounds on the other end. Sometimes it sounded like static. Other times it sounded like distant breathing or faint movement. But there were never any voices. After a few seconds, the line would go silent. My dad insisted it was probably just crossed phone lines or something wrong with the wiring. Then there were the noises from the basement. Every now and then, they would hear something from below the floor. A thump, a scrape. Sometimes what sounded like something shifting or moving around down there. Each time, my dad explained it away. Old houses make noise all the time, he said. Wood expands and contracts. Pipes shift. The foundation settles. But my mom was starting to feel uneasy. The layout of the house didn't help. The bedroom they were staying in was located at the end of a long hallway. To reach it from the main part of the house, you had to walk down that narrow hallway with several closed doors along the sides. At night, the hallway looked especially dark and quiet. Eventually, the strange atmosphere began to get to my mom. One night, she had a dream that frightened her badly. In the dream, she was standing in the hallway outside their bedroom. At the far end of the hallway, she saw a tall man. He stood near the wall, facing slightly away from her. In his hand, he held a knife, and he was slowly dragging the blade along the wall as if he were scraping or carving something into it. The sound of the knife against the wall echoed through the hallway. My mom watched him for a moment in the dream, frozen in place. Then the man suddenly turned toward her and began running down the hallway. He charged straight at her. Just as he got close enough for her to see his face clearly, she woke up. She woke up shaking and covered in sweat. Her heart was racing, and the dream felt so real that for a moment she wasn't even sure she was fully awake. She immediately woke my dad up and told him she wanted to leave the house. Right then. Not in the morning. Right away. My dad tried to calm her down at first. He told her it was just a bad dream and that everything was fine. But she was terrified. The dream had left her with such a strong feeling of danger that she couldn't ignore it. Eventually, my dad gave in. He got up, and the two of them began packing their things in the middle of the night. Before leaving, my dad remembered that he needed to shut off the power again at the breaker. So once again, he had to go down into the basement. When he opened the basement door, he noticed something immediately. The light bulb that normally hung near the bottom of the stairs had burned out. So the basement was completely dark. He grabbed a flashlight and headed down the stairs. The same uneasy feeling returned as soon as he reached the bottom. But he ignored it and walked over to the breaker panel. He switched off the power just like he had done when they arrived. Then he turned around and started walking back toward the stairs. He was about 10 feet away from the steps when something strange happened. The flashlight suddenly exploded in his hand. The bulb burst with a sharp pop, and the glass shattered inside the flashlight. Instantly, the basement went completely black. My dad said the darkness down there felt suffocating. He didn't hesitate. He rushed forward blindly, feeling his way toward the stairs. His foot caught the first step, and he quickly climbed up, pushing the basement door open and slamming it shut behind him. Within minutes, they were in the car and driving away from the house. Neither of them spoke much at first. They were both shaken by the strange night and just wanted to get away from the place. As they drove down the dark roads leaving Baltimore, my mom finally told my dad the full dream she had experienced. She described the tall man standing in the hallway, the knife scraping against the wall, and the way he had suddenly charged at her. She explained that the dream had felt so real that she couldn't stay in the house any longer. When she finished telling the story, my dad went quiet. Then he said something that made the whole situation even more disturbing. The night before, he had the same dream. He hadn't told her about it at the time because he didn't want to scare her. But he had dreamed about the same tall man standing at the end of the hallway. And in his dream, the man had also been holding a knife and scraping it against the wall. When they realized they had both dreamed the exact same thing on different nights, the silence in the car became even heavier. Neither of them ever returned to that house again. I remember one night that scared me badly, even though it ended up having a simple explanation. At the time it happened, though, it felt like something straight out of a nightmare. It's one of those moments where your mind jumps straight to the worst possible conclusion, and for a few minutes everything feels tense and dangerous. This happened when I was living in a small place by myself. It was a fairly normal house, nothing especially old or creepy about it. The layout was simple. My bedroom had a small bathroom connected to it, the kind where the bathroom door opens directly into the bedroom. The kitchen was just down the hallway, and the front and back doors both had solid locks. I had lived there long enough to feel comfortable in the space. Normally, I slept well and didn't worry about strange noises. Like most people, I was used to the occasional creak or thump that houses sometimes make during the night. But one particular night, something happened that woke me up suddenly. It was sometime in the middle of the night, though I don't remember exactly what time. Everything was quiet and dark, the way houses usually are when everyone is asleep and there's no movement anywhere. I was deep asleep when I heard a loud crash coming from the bathroom, connected to my bedroom. The sound was sharp and sudden, like something had been knocked over. To me, it sounded exactly like a person stumbling and falling. The moment I heard it, I sat straight up in bed. When you wake up suddenly from sleep, your brain takes a second to catch up with what's happening. At first, I wasn't sure what I had heard, but the more I thought about it, the more it sounded like someone had just tripped inside my bathroom. That realization sent a rush of adrenaline through me. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possibility: an intruder. Someone had somehow gotten into my house and was now inside my bathroom. The house was silent again after the crash, which somehow made it even more unsettling. If someone had fallen, they might be standing up quietly, waiting or listening. For a few seconds, I stayed completely still in bed, listening carefully. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. But the sound I had heard felt too clear to ignore. I slowly got out of bed, my heart already beating faster. My first instinct was to arm myself with something before confronting whoever might be in the house. So I quietly stepped out of the bedroom and moved down the hallway to the kitchen. The house felt incredibly still as I walked through it. Every little sound seemed louder than usual. The floor creaked slightly under my steps, and the hum of the refrigerator sounded strangely sharp in the quiet. When I reached the kitchen, I grabbed a large kitchen knife from the counter. Holding it in my hand made me feel slightly more confident, though the situation still felt tense. Before heading back to the bedroom, I quickly checked the doors. Both the front and back doors were still locked. The locks were exactly the way I had left them before going to sleep. That made the situation even more confusing. If someone was inside the house, how had they gotten in? Still, the sound I heard had come from the bathroom, and I couldn't ignore it. So I slowly walked back toward my bedroom. As I reached the doorway, I paused for a moment to listen again. The room looked exactly the way I had left it. Dark and quiet. The bathroom door was closed. I stepped inside the bedroom, gripping the knife tightly and trying to stay calm. My mind was racing through different possibilities. Maybe someone had broken in through a window. Maybe they had come in earlier without me noticing. Maybe they were hiding. All those thoughts ran through my head as I approached the bathroom door. I moved slowly and carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I reached the door, I placed my hand on the handle. For a moment, I just stood there, taking a breath and preparing myself. Then I slowly turned the handle and tried to open the door. It didn't open. There was resistance from the other side. The door moved slightly, but something immediately pushed back against it. My heart jumped. It felt exactly like someone was pressing against the door from inside the bathroom. For a second, I froze. Then I tried again, pushing a little harder this time. The door opened slightly, maybe an inch. But as soon as it moved, the resistance came back stronger. The door pushed toward me again, like something heavy was leaning against it from the other side. At that moment, my mind was convinced that someone was in there. It felt exactly like an intruder was bracing their body against the door, trying to keep it shut. I tightened my grip on the knife and tried to push again. The door moved a tiny bit, but the pressure from the other side stayed strong. I could barely open the gap wider than an inch. It felt like a strange standoff. Me pushing from one side, something pushing from the other. I couldn't see inside the bathroom because the gap was too small and the lights were off. The darkness behind the door made everything feel even more intense. My mind kept imagining someone standing there silently, leaning their weight against the door. For several seconds, I didn't know what to do. Should I force the door open? Should I call the police? The tension in that moment felt incredibly real. Then I tried pushing the door again with a bit more force. This time, the door shifted slightly more, just enough for me to see a little bit of what was blocking it. And that's when I realized what had actually happened. It wasn't a person. It was the shower curtain. At some point during the night, the shower curtain had fallen off its rod. When it dropped, it had slipped down between the door and the edge of the shower. The heavy fabric had become jammed tightly in the narrow space between the door and the shower frame. When I tried to open the door, the curtain was bunching up and pushing back against it. That resistance, I felt, wasn't someone holding the door closed. It was just the thick fabric wedged into the gap. Once I understood what was happening, the tension drained out of me almost instantly. I carefully pushed the door open a little more and reached in to pull the curtain away from the door frame. After freeing the fabric, the door opened normally. The bathroom looked exactly the way it should. The fallen curtain lay crumpled partly on the floor and partly against the side of the shower. It must have slipped off the rod and collapsed in just the right position to block the door. I stood there for a moment, letting my heartbeat slowly return to normal. Even though the explanation was simple, the whole experience had been incredibly intense. For several minutes, I had been absolutely convinced there was an intruder in my house. The sound of the curtain falling had perfectly mimicked the noise of someone tripping or crashing into something. And the way it jammed the door made it feel exactly like someone was leaning against it from the other side. Even after realizing the truth, I still felt shaken. It took a while before I could fully relax and go back to bed. Looking back on it now, it's almost funny how quickly our minds can jump to frightening conclusions when we wake up suddenly in the middle of the night. But in that moment, standing in the dark with a knife in my hand and a door pushing back against me, it was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences I've ever had. When I think back on the strangest moment I ever experienced while working a job, one particular night always comes to mind. It happened years ago when I worked as a janitor at a restaurant. It wasn't a glamorous job, but at the time it paid the bills and the hours actually suited me pretty well. My shift started very late at night, technically early morning. I would usually arrive around 2 in the morning and work until about 6. The restaurant closed well before that, so by the time I started my shift, the building was completely empty. No customers, no cooks, no waiters, just me, a quiet building, and several hours of cleaning. The job was simple, but repetitive. I would sweep and mop the floors, wipe down counters, clean the kitchen equipment, take out the trash, and make sure everything was spotless before the morning crew arrived. Sometimes I would turn on a small radio while I worked, just to break the silence. Most nights were incredibly quiet. In fact, the silence was one of the things I actually liked about the job. The restaurant during the day was loud and busy, but during those early morning hours, it felt almost peaceful. The lights were dim, the kitchen equipment sat idle, and the empty dining room stretched out with rows of booths and tables, waiting for the next day's customers. One of the perks of the job was that management wasn't very strict about small things as long as the work got done. Sometimes, after finishing my tasks early, I would pour myself a draft beer from the tap behind the bar. It felt like a small reward after several hours of cleaning. One particular night started exactly like that. I arrived at the restaurant around 2 in the morning as usual. The building was dark and quiet when I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I flipped on the lights and started working through my routine. Sweep the floors, clean the counters, take out the trash, wipe down the kitchen surfaces. Everything went smoothly that night. I moved quickly and stayed focused, and before long I realized I had finished most of my tasks earlier than usual. When that happened, I usually took advantage of the quiet time, so I walked behind the bar, poured myself a cold draft beer, and carried it out to one of the booths in the dining area. The booth I chose was near a large window that looked out toward the parking lot of the neighboring business next door. That business was always closed during my shift, so the lot outside was completely empty. The dim streetlights cast long shadows across the asphalt, and occasionally a car would pass by on the distant road. But most of the time, it was completely still. I sat there slowly drinking my beer, enjoying the quiet moment. After finishing it, I leaned back in the booth and closed my eyes for a minute. Sometimes when I finished early like that, I would take a short nap before finishing the final checks around the restaurant. The booths were surprisingly comfortable, especially when the building was silent and the lights were low. I must have drifted off pretty quickly. I don't know exactly how long I slept, but suddenly I woke up with a jolt. A loud, screeching sound had shattered the silence outside. For a moment, I didn't even know where I was. That groggy feeling you get when you wake up suddenly made everything feel disorienting. Then I heard the sound again, tires scraping hard against pavement. I turned my head toward the window. Outside in the neighboring parking lot, a large black van had just come to a sudden stop. The vehicle looked shiny and dark under the streetlights, its tires still angled slightly as if the driver had braked hard. The screeching sound I heard must have been the van sliding slightly as it stopped. For a second, I just sat there staring. Then the back doors of the van swung open. 4 men stepped out. Even now, years later, I remember how strange they looked. They were all wearing black suits, not casual clothes, not work uniforms. Actual black suits with white shirts and ties. It looked almost exactly like something out of a movie. The first thought that popped into my head was that they looked like characters from Men in Black. The driver stepped out from the front seat and stayed near the van, standing beside the open back doors. He looked around slowly, scanning the area as if he was watching for something. The other 4 men moved quickly. 2 of them walked around the front side of the restaurant. The other 2 moved toward the back. Watching this unfold, I felt a sudden rush of anxiety. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would 4 men in suits show up in the middle of the night at an empty restaurant? Why were they spreading out around the building? The way they moved made it look like they were surrounding the place, and I was the only person inside. My heart started beating faster. At that moment, I honestly didn't know what to think. Maybe they were security agents. Maybe they were investigators. Or maybe they were something far worse. I quickly slid out of the booth and moved quietly toward the kitchen area. The last thing I wanted was for them to notice someone inside the restaurant. In the kitchen, I grabbed the largest knife I could find. It was one of the big chef's knives we used for food prep. Holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. I returned to the dining area, but chose a different booth this time, one that gave me a better angle to watch the parking lot without being easily seen from outside. From there, I tried to observe what the men were doing. Unfortunately, I could only see 2 of them clearly. They moved slowly around the outside of the building, looking around the area carefully. Their movements seemed deliberate, almost like they were searching for something specific. One of them stopped near the side wall and crouched down briefly, examining the ground. The other stood nearby, scanning the surroundings. Neither of them spoke loudly enough for me to hear anything. Meanwhile, the driver remained near the van, standing beside the open back doors. The whole scene felt surreal. It was the middle of the night. The restaurant was supposed to be completely empty, and here were 5 men in black suits surrounding the building like they were part of some secret operation. I stayed perfectly still in my booth, gripping the knife and watching. My mind kept jumping between possibilities. Were they about to break in? Were they searching for someone? Were they after me? Every second felt longer than the last. Then something even stranger happened. The man standing by the van suddenly made a sound. At first, I didn't understand what I was hearing. It sounded like a bird call. A strange whistling or chirping noise, almost like someone trying to imitate the call of a bird. The sound echoed across the empty parking lot. The moment it happened, everything changed. The 4 men who had been walking around the building immediately reacted. Without hesitation, they turned and ran back toward the van. Within seconds, all 4 of them jumped into the back. The driver slammed the door shut, jumped into the front seat, and the van roared to life. The tires squealed again as the vehicle sped away into the darkness. And just like that, they were gone. The parking lot was silent again. I sat there in the booth for several minutes afterward, still holding the knife and trying to process what I had just seen. Nothing about the situation made sense. 5 men in suits arriving in the middle of the night, surrounding the building, searching for something, then leaving immediately after a strange bird call signal. To this day, I still have no idea who they were. Maybe they were security personnel looking for someone. Maybe they were investigating something nearby, or maybe they were involved in something I'll never understand. All I know is that for a few minutes that night, sitting alone in that empty restaurant at 3 in the morning, it felt like I had accidentally stepped into the middle of something mysterious. And even now, I still wonder what those men were really doing there. I went to Las Vegas for my 21st birthday with my best friend. It was supposed to be one of those trips you always remember in a good way. We had been talking about it for months before it actually happened. The idea of finally turning 21 and celebrating in a city like Vegas sounded almost unreal to us. We had imagined the bright lights, the casinos, the music, and the wild energy that everyone says fills the city 24 hours a day. When the day finally came, we were already in a party mood before we even arrived. Our trip started early that morning at the first airport we departed from. Since it was my birthday, we decided to celebrate right away instead of waiting until we reached Vegas. We ordered drinks while waiting for our flight and kept joking about how strange it felt to legally drink while traveling somewhere famous for partying. By the time we boarded the plane, we were already laughing loudly and feeling the excitement build. We were flying first class, which made the whole thing feel even more special. During the flight, the drinks kept coming. Flight attendants passed by offering refills, and we happily accepted each one. We were talking about what we would do when we arrived, making plans to walk the Strip, visit casinos, and maybe find some wild birthday adventure to laugh about later. Everything felt light and fun. At the time, the biggest problem we thought we might have that day was deciding which casino to visit first. But there was one thing we had not thought about at all. After hours of drinking at the airport and then more drinks during the flight, both of us had to use the bathroom extremely badly by the time the plane landed. When the plane touched down in Las Vegas, we practically jumped out of our seats the moment the seatbelt sign turned off. We hurried through the airport terminal as fast as we could, trying not to laugh too hard because the situation had become urgent. Anyone who has ever had to hold it for too long knows that strange combination of panic and comedy at the same time. We scanned the airport for the nearest restroom. Luckily, we spotted one not far from our gate. Without saying much, we both sped up our walking pace and headed straight toward it. At that point, our only goal was getting there before it became a real disaster. The restroom was fairly busy, which was not surprising considering how many people pass through the Las Vegas airport every day. But we didn't care. We rushed inside and immediately headed toward the open urinals. We didn't stop to think about which ones we chose. We simply grabbed the two closest open spots because we needed them immediately. Looking back, I always think about how funny it is that such a small decision could lead to such a strange memory that would stay with me for years. As I stepped up to the urinal, I noticed from the corner of my eye that someone was standing very close to the one next to me. I didn't actually turn my head to look at him directly. It was more of that peripheral vision you notice without focusing on it. The man standing next to me was shorter than me and had a stocky build. From what I could tell, he looked like a middle-aged Mexican gentleman. There was nothing unusual about someone standing there using the restroom like everyone else. Airports are full of people from everywhere. But something about the way he was standing felt strange to me right away. Even without turning my head, I could tell that he was standing closer to me than most people normally would. It immediately gave me an uncomfortable feeling that I could not really explain at the time. Sometimes your instincts react before your brain fully processes what is happening. I tried to ignore it and just focus on finishing up quickly so I could leave. But the uncomfortable feeling kept growing stronger. Then things got even stranger. The man finished before I did. I could tell from the movement beside me that he had stepped back slightly. Normally, someone would simply leave at that point, wash their hands, and walk out. That's how public bathrooms usually work. But instead of leaving, he stayed there. I remember thinking for a split second that maybe he was just adjusting his clothes or something normal like that. I still hadn't turned my head to look at him directly because, honestly, most people try to mind their own business in those situations. Then, suddenly, he turned toward me. Before I even fully understood what was happening, I saw a movement right beside me. He was facing in my direction and acting in a way that completely caught me off guard. It happened so fast that my brain needed a moment to catch up. The man was holding himself in both hands and shaking it toward me in a very aggressive and bizarre way. For a moment, I honestly thought my brain was playing tricks on me. It felt like one of those strange moments where you ask yourself if what you are seeing is actually real. Airports are already stressful places, and we had been drinking all day, so my mind tried to come up with some kind of explanation. But there was no misunderstanding. He continued shaking it repeatedly while looking in my direction, with an intense and angry expression on his face. It was one of the strangest and most uncomfortable moments I had ever experienced in a public place. Everything inside me just froze. I didn't know if he was mentally unstable, if he was trying to scare me, or if he simply didn't care that anyone else was there. The whole situation felt so unexpected and surreal that I didn't know how to react for a few seconds. My brain ran through several possibilities in a flash. Was he trying to splash something toward me? Was he trying to provoke a reaction? Was he just completely out of his mind? I had absolutely no idea. All I knew was that I needed to get away from that spot immediately. As quickly as I could, I finished up and stepped away. My heart was beating faster than it should have been for something that technically only lasted a few seconds. I moved toward the sinks as if I were in a daze. The bright lights above the mirrors suddenly felt overwhelming after the strange moment I had just experienced. I turned on the water and splashed some on my face, trying to clear my head and calm down. My best friend had already finished and was standing a little further away waiting for me. He looked at me with a confused expression because he could tell something weird had just happened. For a moment, I didn't even know how to explain it. I just leaned over the sink, letting cold water run over my hands and face while trying to process what I had just witnessed. It was one of those moments that feels almost unreal while it's happening. My friend asked if I was okay. I looked up at him through the mirror and said something like, "You are not going to believe what just happened." He started laughing, thinking I was joking, but I wasn't laughing. When I finally explained what had happened next to me, his expression changed from amusement to disbelief. He glanced over toward the row of urinals, as if expecting to see the guy still standing there. But the man had already left. Just like that, so he had disappeared back into the crowd of travelers moving through the airport. For a few seconds, we both stood there silently. Then my friend started laughing again, partly because the situation sounded so ridiculous and partly because we were both still a little buzzed from the drinks earlier. Even though we laughed about it later, in that moment I still felt shocked and confused. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to understand what could possibly make someone behave that way in a public airport restroom. Eventually, we finished washing our hands and walked out of the restroom. The noise of the airport rushed back around us as we stepped into the busy terminal. People were rolling suitcases past us. Announcements were echoing through the speakers, and bright lights filled the long corridors. It was like stepping back into normal life after a bizarre interruption. We began walking toward baggage claim, still talking about what had happened. The more we talked about it, the more surreal it sounded. My friend kept shaking his head and laughing, saying that this was definitely not the welcome to Vegas we had expected. I told him that of all the things I imagined might happen during my 21st birthday trip, that moment had never crossed my mind. But in a strange way, it became the story that defined the beginning of that trip. Later that night, we would see casinos, bright neon lights, crowded streets, music, and everything else Las Vegas is famous for. We would meet interesting people, walk miles along the Strip, and celebrate my birthday exactly the way we had planned. But no matter how many exciting things happened afterward, that bizarre moment in the airport restroom remained one of the most unforgettable memories from the entire trip. Even years later, whenever I think back to that birthday vacation, that strange encounter always pops into my mind first. I still remember the shock of it, the confusion, and the way I stood at the sink trying to understand what had just happened. Some memories stay with you not because they are important, but because they are so strange that your brain never quite knows where to place them. And that moment in the Las Vegas airport restroom is one of those memories I know I will never forget. I have been living in Kampala, Uganda for quite some time now. And whenever I tell people where I live, they usually react with a mix of curiosity and concern. Many people imagine East Africa as a dangerous place, especially if they have never been here before. But the truth is that Kampala, at least the parts where I spent most of my time, has always had a reputation for being fairly safe. Life here moves at a relaxed pace in many neighborhoods, and people are used to seeing familiar faces every day. Communities tend to look out for each other in ways that sometimes surprise visitors. In many areas of the city, it is normal to see people walking around even late at night, especially along streets that are well lit. Small shops stay open late, and there are always boda drivers passing through. Bodas, which are motorcycle taxis, are one of the main ways people move around the city. They are everywhere. You can stand on almost any corner and see several of them waiting for passengers. One of the things that makes the community feel safer is the strong sense of social control. If someone is caught stealing or harassing someone else, the reaction from the surrounding people can be immediate. Shop owners often step outside when they hear someone yelling for help. Neighbors come running to see what is happening. In some cases, the situation escalates quickly for the person committing the crime. I remember one incident that showed just how seriously people here take theft. A man once tried to snatch my purse while I was walking down a street during the day. Before I even had time to react properly, a police officer who happened to be nearby rushed over and tackled him. What happened next was honestly a little shocking. The officer began beating the man so aggressively that I actually had to step in and ask him to stop. Even though the man had tried to steal from me, the punishment was getting out of hand. Moments like that make it clear that thieves who are caught in the act here can face serious consequences. Because of that, many neighborhoods develop a reputation for being safe. Word spreads quickly in Kampala. If something unusual or dangerous happens in an area, everyone hears about it almost immediately. For a long time, the neighborhood where my boyfriend and I lived was considered one of those quiet places where nothing really happened. Our home was located off one of the smaller side roads that branched off from a main street. That layout is very common in Uganda. The main road is usually paved and busy with traffic, while the side roads leading into residential areas are dirt roads. Most homes are located along those dirt roads. They tend to be darker at night because street lights are less common there, but the neighborhoods themselves are usually peaceful. People know their neighbors. Children play outside during the day. In the evenings, you can often hear music or conversations drifting from nearby houses. One evening, my boyfriend and I decided to go out for a few drinks at a bar that was not far from our house. It was one of those relaxed nights where the weather felt perfect and the air was warm but comfortable. Kampala evenings can be beautiful like that. The city quiets down a bit, but there is still a gentle hum of activity everywhere. We spent a couple of hours at the bar talking, I laughing and enjoying ourselves. Eventually, we decided it was time to head home. Instead of calling a boda or taking a car, we chose to walk. Our house was only about 15 minutes away, and the night felt calm and pleasant. The walk started out completely normal. We moved along the main road, passing a few small shops and restaurants that were still open. Occasionally, a boda would pass by, the sound of its engine fading into the distance as it continued down the road. Everything felt peaceful. But things started to feel slightly different when we reached the area where we needed to turn off the main road and head toward the dirt road that led to our home. Just as we were approaching the turn, a boda driver passed by us. As he rode past, he called out something to us. His voice carried over the noise of his motorcycle. "Careful. That was all we heard clearly. He kept driving, and whatever he said next faded into the distance before we could make it out. My boyfriend shrugged it off, but something about the moment stuck in my mind. It felt like he had been trying to warn us about something. And before I could say much about it, another strange thing happened. We heard the sound of multiple motorcycles approaching behind us. When I turned around, I saw a small group of bodas speeding down the road. There must have been 4 or 5 of them. As they passed by, I heard the word police shouted more than once. The driver seemed excited or alarmed about something. They quickly disappeared down the road ahead of us, leaving us standing there in sudden silence. That was the moment when a cold feeling settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. My boyfriend, however, seemed completely relaxed. He had been living in Uganda longer than I had, and I think he had grown comfortable with the rhythms of the place. He didn't appear worried at all. In fact, he continued joking around as we walked. At one point, he even stopped and tried to hug me. Normally, I would have laughed and hugged him back, but in that moment, My instincts were screaming at me that we needed to get home as quickly as possible. The quietness of the side road ahead of us felt wrong. Usually you could hear distant music, voices, or dogs barking somewhere nearby. But that night, it felt unusually still. Every alarm in my head was going off. I pushed him away gently and told him we needed to hurry. My focus had shifted entirely to getting inside our compound as fast as possible. Our home was inside a fenced property with a gate, and we also had a guard who stayed there overnight. Once we were inside those gates, I knew I would feel safe. We continued walking toward the entrance of our compound. I had already pulled my keys out of my bag as we approached the gate. Meanwhile, my boyfriend was still casually searching through his pockets for his own keys. When we reached the fence, I unlocked the gate quickly and stepped inside. The moment I was on the other side, I felt a wave of relief. At the time, we didn't know exactly what had happened that night. But the next day, we learned something that shook our entire neighborhood. One of our neighbors and friends, a man named Lawrence, had been attacked that same evening. While walking near the area where we had been, two men had brutally beaten him. When we saw him later, the injuries were horrifying. His neck had swollen so badly that it looked unnatural, almost like a large growth. His face and body were covered in cuts and bruises. The attackers had even tried to cut off his leg with a machete. Luckily, they struck his leg with the wrong side of the blade. Instead of a deep, life-threatening wound, it resulted in a much shallower cut. Still, the attack was incredibly violent. News of what had happened spread quickly through the neighborhood. Everyone was shocked because crimes like that were extremely rare in our area. People talked about it everywhere, at shops, at bars, in homes. No one could believe something so brutal had happened so close to where we lived. Lawrence eventually recovered from his injuries, but the fear in the community didn't disappear. Unfortunately, the attack turned out to be the beginning of something worse. More incidents began to occur. A Ugandan girl was beaten severely in front of a primary school. Witnesses reported seeing two men riding unregistered bodas. They carried pangas, which are large machetes commonly used as tools in many parts of Africa. The attackers didn't seem to care who their victims were: Ugandan, Indian, white foreigners. Anyone walking alone could become a target. One of my friends was stopped by the two men while walking home. They threatened her with their weapons and stole her bag. She was lucky that they didn't hurt her further. Another friend was not so fortunate. She was attacked and sexually assaulted during a robbery. Even a boda driver became a victim. The only evidence left behind from that attack was blood on the ground and broken pieces of his motorcycle. And it was terrifying to realize that this kind of violence was happening in a place that had once felt so peaceful. The most frustrating part was the lack of response from the police. Despite multiple reports and growing fear in the community, nothing seemed to change. In Uganda, it can sometimes be very difficult to push the police into action. Eventually, my boyfriend and I decided to move to a different house along a more well-lit main road. We hoped that the increased traffic and visibility would make it safer. At the time, we had not yet hired a new security guard for the property, but we did have two dogs. They were wonderful animals, loyal and protective, though we had never really thought of them as guard dogs before. One night, my boyfriend was away on a business trip, which meant I was alone in the house. It was around 2 a.m. when my phone rang. It was him calling to say goodnight. We were chatting casually when I suddenly heard the sound of motorcycles outside the gate. The sound instantly put me on edge. I ended the call and moved quietly through the house, turning off lights and anything else that made noise. The house fell completely silent. Then the dogs began reacting. The female dog usually barked when stray dogs passed by outside the gate, but this time her reaction was completely different. She was growling deeply and barking with an intensity I had never heard before. My heart started pounding. I grabbed a machete that I kept in the house and moved to a spot where I could watch the gate while staying hidden. Every window in the house had metal bars, which gave me some sense of protection. For several tense minutes, nothing moved except the dogs. Then suddenly, both dogs sprinted across the compound toward the gate. A few seconds later, I heard the motorcycles rev their engines and speed away down the road. Whoever had been outside the gate had decided to leave. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, gripping that machete and listening to every sound until the sun finally began to rise. Nothing else happened. But that night made one thing very clear to me. Those two dogs had probably saved me from something terrible. Not long after that, we hired a proper security guard as well. Even now, when I think about that night, I feel grateful for those dogs who stood between me and whoever might have been waiting outside the gate in the darkness. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. When I was growing up in Albuquerque, my daily routine was simple and predictable. Every weekday morning, I would walk to elementary school with a few friends who lived in the same neighborhood. Our houses were scattered across a few nearby streets, so we would meet at certain corners and slowly gather into a small group as we made our way toward school. Over time, that walk became one of the most familiar parts of our lives. We followed the same path every day, talking about whatever things mattered to kids at that age. Sometimes we talked about school assignments, sometimes about cartoons we had watched the night before, and sometimes we just joked around about nothing at all. When you are a kid, even a short walk can feel like an adventure if you are with friends. Along the route we took to school, there was a vacant lot that sat behind a row of houses. It wasn't anything special to look at. In fact, most adults probably would have thought it was an ugly place. But to us, it was just another part of the neighborhood landscape. The lot had tall trees lining one side, their branches stretching out in messy shapes that gave patches of shade throughout the day. On the opposite side, there was an arroyo, which was basically a dry irrigation ditch carved into the dirt. During the rainy season, water sometimes flowed through it, but most of the time, it was just a long, dusty trench cutting across the land. The ground in the lot was uneven and covered with weeds in some places. Because it was empty land that no one really cared about, people often dumped things there. Over time, it became a kind of unofficial dumping ground. You could find all sorts of random objects scattered around. Broken furniture, rusty metal parts, old appliances that had clearly stopped working years ago. There were washing machines with their doors hanging open, bent shopping carts, and pieces of wood that had once been part of something else. To adults, it probably looked like junk. To us, it looked like possibilities. The reason we liked the lot so much was because it shortened our walk to school. Instead of staying on the sidewalks and following the long curve of the streets, we could cut straight through the trees, slip under a sagging section of chain-link fence, and cross the open dirt. Doing that shaved several minutes off our route. At first, we only passed through the lot quickly on our way to school or home. But kids have a way of turning any space into their own territory, and eventually we started spending more time there. One afternoon, we noticed something new in the lot. Someone had dumped an old couch there. It was worn out and dirty, with faded fabric and a few tears in the cushions, but to us it felt like a major discovery. Most of the junk in the lot wasn't very comfortable or useful, but a couch was different. With the enthusiasm that only kids can have, we dragged it upright and positioned it so we could actually sit on it. That simple act changed everything. From that day on, the couch became our meeting spot. We started calling it the couch, like it was some famous landmark. On the way home from school, we would stop there for a few minutes before heading back to our houses. We would sit on the worn cushions, kick our feet in the dirt, and talk about whatever was on our minds. Yeah, sometimes someone would still have snacks left over from lunch, and we would share them. Chips, cookies, or half a sandwich wrapped in crinkled foil. The lot slowly began to feel like our own secret clubhouse. Over time, we dragged other random objects over to the couch to make the place feel even more like a hangout spot. Someone found an old weight bench that had been dumped nearby and dragged it over. Someone else brought a wooden crate that we used as a kind of table. Piece by piece, our strange little dirt lot living room came together. Looking back now, it was probably filthy and unsafe in every possible way. But when you are a kid, you don't think about those things. One afternoon, a friend of mine found half of a cigarette lying in the dirt. He picked it up with curiosity and said he wondered what smoking tasted like. None of us had any idea, of course. He lit it and took a puff. Within seconds, he started coughing violently and made a disgusted face. He said it tasted awful. We all laughed and told him that maybe that meant smoking wasn't such a great idea after all. Moments like that were part of what made those afternoons memorable. It felt like our own private world, hidden away in a forgotten corner of the neighborhood. For months, that lot and that couch were just a normal part of our routine. Then one morning, something happened that none of us would ever forget. On that particular day, I had woken up late. I rushed through getting ready and ran out the door trying to catch up with my friends before they got too far ahead. I could see them in the distance as they walked toward the vacant lot. They followed the usual path, slipping through the trees and ducking under the bent chain link fence. I ran faster, hoping to catch up before they reached the other side. As I entered the lot, I looked ahead toward the spot where the couch usually sat. I saw my friends standing there in a small circle. At first, I thought they were just waiting for me, like they sometimes did. Maybe they had decided to stop for a few minutes before continuing to school. But something about the way they were standing felt strange. None of them were sitting down. They weren't talking either. They were just standing there. I couldn't see the couch itself from where I was. Curious, I kept running toward them. Then suddenly, the smell hit me. It was so strong that it felt like it slammed straight into my mouth and nose at the same time. I stopped running instantly. For a moment, my brain simply froze. The smell was something I had never experienced before. It was thick and heavy and awful in a way that made my stomach twist. My friends were standing there with the same stunned expressions on their faces. Then I saw what they were looking at. The couch was gone. In its place was a large blackened circle, burned into the dirt. Scattered across that burned area were the charred remains of the couch, pieces of the frame and melted fragments of what had once been cushions. And on top of those remains was something else, a human body, or what was left of one. The body was burned almost beyond recognition. The skin had turned dark and cracked from the heat. Most of the hair was gone entirely. One arm was sticking upward from the burned pile. The wrist was bent backward at a strange angle, and the fingers were curled tightly into a shape that looked almost like a claw. Around the body, there were melted patches of material that we didn't understand at the time. Looking back now, I realize it was probably melted clothing and fat from the intense heat of the fire. The jaw of the skull was exposed and hanging open in a way that looked unnatural and terrifying. None of us spoke. We just stood there, frozen in shock. Then one of my friends suddenly leaned forward and vomited down the front of his shirt. That seemed to break whatever spell had been holding us there. All at once, the reality of what we were seeing crashed into us. We started crying and shouting at the same time. Without saying anything to each other, we turned and ran. We ran out of the lot, through the trees, under the broken fence, and back toward our homes as fast as our legs could carry us. When we reached our houses, we tried to explain what we had seen, though the words came out in confused fragments through tears. Our parents immediately called the police. I remember hearing bits of conversation between adults that day, but none of us kids talked about the scene again. We stopped cutting through that lot entirely. From that day forward, we took the longer route to school every time. The strange dirt lot living room we had built there was gone, replaced by a memory none of us wanted to revisit. I never went back to see what happened after the police arrived. I don't know who the person was or how the fire started. All I know is that the place where we once laughed, shared snacks, and wasted time after school became something else entirely. A quiet reminder that sometimes the ordinary places in life can suddenly become the setting for something deeply disturbing. And after that morning, none of us ever looked at that vacant lot the same way again. The apartment I lived in at the time was small but comfortable. The kind of place that felt ordinary in every possible way. It was the sort of place where nothing unusual ever really happened. 2 bedrooms, a narrow hallway connecting them, a living room with a worn couch, and a television that was almost always on in the evenings. My roommate and I had been living there long enough that the routines of daily life had settled into something predictable and easy. Our apartment layout was simple. When you walked through the front door, the living room opened up immediately in front of you. The hallway began just off to the side. My bedroom was the first door on the left side of that hallway, while my roommate's room sat at the very end. It wasn't a long hallway, but at night it could feel darker than the rest of the apartment because the only light that reached it came from the living room. Most nights, we both came home around the same time after work, cooked something simple, watched TV for a while, and then went to our separate rooms. There was nothing mysterious about our schedule. That was probably why what happened one particular night stayed with me for years afterward. That evening had been completely normal. I got home a little earlier than my roommate, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes one of us had errands to run or stayed late at work. I didn't think anything of it. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and dropped my bag near the couch like I usually did. The apartment was quiet. No lights were on except the one I turned on when I walked in. I changed into comfortable clothes. I grabbed something quick to eat from the kitchen and sat down on the couch to watch television. I say it was just one of those quiet nights where you relax and let your mind drift while whatever show happens to be on plays in the background. I remember checking my phone a couple of times, expecting a message from my roommate saying he was on his way home. But nothing came. That didn't really concern me either. Sometimes he would stop somewhere after work or visit friends. After a while, I started feeling tired. It had been a long day, and the quiet apartment made it even easier to feel sleepy. Eventually, I shut off the TV, turned off the living room light, and headed down the hallway toward my bedroom. For some reason that night, I left my bedroom door open when I went to sleep. Normally, I closed it. But sometimes when the apartment felt too quiet, I left it slightly open, so a little bit of light from the hallway could drift into the room if someone turned on a lamp outside. It made the place feel less empty. I crawled into bed and fell asleep pretty quickly. Everything was calm and silent. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know exactly what time it was at first, but when I glanced toward the faint glow of my alarm clock, I saw that it was around 3 in the morning. The apartment was completely dark except for that small digital display. For a few seconds, I lay there in that half-awake state where your mind is still foggy with sleep. Then I noticed something. In the darkness beyond my open bedroom door, I could see movement in the hallway. Someone was there. At first, my sleepy brain didn't react with any fear because the shape moving down the hallway looked exactly like my roommate. It was about the same height and build as him. The person was walking slowly, almost tiredly, toward the end of the hallway where his room was. The movement was quiet, but I could see enough to make out what looked like a large bag being dragged along the floor behind him. Even in the dim darkness, it looked like a bag filled with clothes. I remember watching for a few seconds, still half asleep, trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure moved the same way my roommate usually did when he came home late after a long day. Slow steps, shoulders slightly slouched, dragging something behind him like he didn't have the energy to carry it. In my sleepy state, the explanation seemed obvious. He must have just gotten home. My mind immediately jumped to the idea that he had probably brought laundry with him and decided to deal with it right away. I remember thinking something very simple and slightly annoyed. Why the hell is this guy doing laundry in the middle of the night? But that was the extent of my curiosity. I didn't sit up or call out to him. I didn't check the hallway or ask what he was doing. Instead, I simply rolled over in bed and let sleep pull me back under. The moment seemed too ordinary to question. As far as I was concerned, my roommate had come home late and was dealing with a bag of clothes. That was the entire explanation. The next thing I remember clearly was waking up in the morning. Sunlight was coming through the window, and my alarm clock told me it was time to get ready for work. The strange moment from the night before barely crossed my mind as I got out of bed. I walked into the hallway and noticed that my roommate's bedroom door was closed. Again, nothing unusual about that. He often slept later than I did. I got ready for work, grabbed my bag, and left the apartment without really thinking about the night before. The entire memory felt like one of those sleepy half-dreams that fades quickly once you start your day. Work was busy, and by the time evening came around, I'd completely forgotten about it. When I returned to the apartment later that day, I noticed something right away. The place was quiet. The living room lights were off, and there was no sign that my roommate had been home all day. His bedroom door was still closed. I assumed he must still be at work or out somewhere. Around 7 in the evening, I heard the front door open. My roommate walked in carrying a laundry hamper filled with clean clothes. He looked relaxed and greeted me casually as he stepped inside. I asked him how his day had been, the same way roommates usually do when they see each other after work. That was when he told me something that made my stomach tighten slightly. He explained that after work the day before, he had gone to visit his mother. Apparently, he had taken some laundry with him and ended up staying overnight at her place. He had just come back that evening after spending the night there. At first, I thought I must have misunderstood him. I asked him again what time he had come home the previous night. He looked confused and said he hadn't come home at all. He told me he hadn't set foot in the apartment since leaving the day before. I remember standing there in the living room, staring at the laundry hamper in his hands while my mind slowly replayed the memory from the 3 in the morning, the figure in the hallway, The slow, tired steps, the bag of clothes dragging across the floor, the shape that looked exactly like him walking toward his bedroom. Except now I knew something that made that memory impossible. My roommate had not been in the apartment that night. He had been at his mother's house the entire time, which meant that whoever, or whatever, I saw walking down the hallway at 3 in the morning could not have been him. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that I must have dreamed it. Maybe I had been half asleep and imagined the entire thing. Maybe my brain had turned some random shadow into the shape of a person. But the memory didn't feel like a dream. It felt clear and ordinary in the way real moments usually do. I remembered seeing the bag dragging behind the figure. I remembered watching it move down the hallway toward his room. And most of all, I remembered thinking about laundry before falling back asleep. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment sometimes. I don't know what I saw in that hallway. Maybe it really was just a trick of the darkness, and my sleepy mind filling in details that weren't there. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever the truth is, I still remember waking up in the darkness, looking down the hallway, and watching a figure that looked exactly like my roommate, quietly walking toward a room he had never entered that night. About half a year ago, something happened to a close friend of mine that still creeps me out whenever I think about it. It wasn't something that happened to me directly, but hearing the story from him and seeing the way he reacted while telling it made it feel disturbingly real. Even now, when the topic comes up among our group of friends, the conversation usually becomes quiet for a moment. None of us ever figured out exactly what happened that night. My friend had gone out partying with a group of people like we often did on weekends. It wasn't anything unusual. We lived in a city where nightlife was a normal part of social life, especially for people in their 20s. Bars stayed open late, music blasted from clubs, and the streets were often full of people moving from one place to another. That particular night had started the same way many others had. The group had met up in the evening and began hopping between a few different bars. Everyone was in a good mood. Drinks were flowing freely, and people were laughing and telling stories. My friend was someone who usually handled alcohol fairly well, but that night he apparently drank far more than usual. At some point during the night, things became hazy for him. The last clear memories he had were from earlier in the evening, when the group was still together. After that, everything became blurred and fragmented. Alcohol can do that sometimes, especially when someone drinks far beyond their normal limit. Memories stop forming properly, and the person moves through the night without truly remembering what is happening. According to the friends who had been with him, he seemed fine for most of the evening. He was talking, joking, and acting like his usual self. But as the night went on, he became noticeably more intoxicated. Eventually, he wandered off from the group for a while. At the time, no one thought much of it. When people are drinking and moving between crowded places, it's common for someone to disappear for a bit and show up again later. Usually, they are just outside smoking, talking to someone new, or getting food from a nearby stand. But that night, he never came back. The next thing he remembered clearly was waking up somewhere completely unfamiliar. When he opened his eyes, he immediately realized something was wrong. He was lying on a bare mattress in a room he had never seen before. There were no sheets, no blankets, and no furniture around him besides that mattress. The room looked empty and worn down, like a place that wasn't meant for anyone to live comfortably. For a moment, he thought maybe he was still dreaming. Then he noticed something that made the situation even more disturbing. He was completely naked from the waist down. His pants and underwear were gone. His wallet and phone were also missing, and his body hurt. When he looked down at himself, he saw scratches covering his skin in several places. Some were shallow, but others were deeper and red. There were also bite marks along his arms and shoulders. Seeing that instantly sent him into panic. He had no memory of how he got there, what had happened during the missing hours of the night, or who had brought him to that place. His mind started racing through every terrible possibility. The room itself was quiet and dimly lit by daylight coming through a small window. The walls were plain and slightly dirty, and the air smelled stale. He quickly got up from the mattress and began looking around the room for some clue about where he was, but there was nothing useful. No personal belongings, no decorations, no signs that anyone actually lived there. Just the mattress and the empty space. That was when the fear really started to sink in. He needed to get out of there immediately. He walked out of the room and into a short hallway, hoping to find a normal front door he could simply open and leave through. Instead, he found something that made the situation even worse. The front door was blocked with heavy metal bars. They were mounted across the door from the inside. I almost liked the kind of reinforcement used in places where people want to make absolutely sure the door cannot be forced open. Seeing that made his stomach drop. At that moment, he realized he might actually be trapped inside the building. His thoughts became frantic. He had no phone to call anyone, no idea where he was, and barely any clothing. Going out the front door clearly wasn't an option. So he went back into the room where he had woken up and looked around more carefully. The only possible way out was the window. It was slightly open, just enough for someone to squeeze through. He climbed onto the mattress and carefully pushed the window wider. When he looked outside, he realized he was several floors above the ground. The drop below was far enough that falling would almost certainly mean serious injury. But he didn't feel like he had much of a choice. Staying inside that apartment felt far more dangerous than climbing out. So he slowly climbed through the window and onto the narrow ledge outside. He pressed himself against the wall of the building, trying not to look down. His hands and feet searched carefully for any small foothold along the exterior surface. The building walls were rough enough that he could grip them, but the situation was still incredibly risky. One wrong step could send him falling. He moved slowly along the outside wall, inch by inch, until he reached the next window belonging to the neighboring apartment. Luckily for him, that window was open. He peered inside cautiously. The room looked empty. After taking a deep breath, he climbed through the window and into the apartment. The place seemed quiet. There were signs that someone lived there, but no one was currently inside. His main priority at that moment was finding clothes. Running through the apartment half naked would draw too much attention. He searched quickly and eventually found a pair of trousers lying over a chair. Without thinking twice, he grabbed them and pulled them on. They didn't fit perfectly, but they were good enough. Then he left the apartment the normal way, through the door and down the stairs of the building. Once he was outside, he didn't stop moving. He just kept walking until he was far away from that place. Later, when he reunited with the friends he had been out with that night, they tried to piece together what might have happened. The last time anyone clearly remembered seeing him was earlier in the evening at one of the bars. He had been standing near the entrance talking to someone. Not a friend. Not someone any of them recognized. According to them, it was a very old man. That detail made the entire story even stranger. None of us ever figured out who that man was or where my friend had been taken during the missing hours of that night. The apartment he woke up in was never identified. His phone and wallet were never recovered. And the scratches and bite marks eventually healed without ever revealing exactly how they had been caused. To this day, whenever he tells the story, he always pauses at the same moment. The moment he woke up on that bare mattress, in a room he had never seen before, with no memory of how he got there. Because sometimes the scariest part of an experience isn't what you know happened. It's everything that might have happened in the hours you can't remember. When I was in high school, around grade 10, back in 2007, my life was pretty typical for a teenager growing up in a quiet neighborhood. Most days revolved around school, hanging out with friends, and trying to find ways to make weekends feel longer than they actually were. My neighborhood wasn't very big, but it had that comfortable suburban feeling where everyone more or less knew each other, and the streets felt familiar enough that walking around at night didn't usually feel dangerous. About a block away from my house, there was a small park that sat right in the middle of the neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, just a patch of grass surrounded by houses, with a few old trees scattered around and a small playground area with swings and a slide. During the daytime, the park was usually full of kids from the neighborhood running around, parents watching from nearby benches, and the occasional dog walker passing through. For us teenagers, though, the park served a different purpose. It was basically a shortcut. If you wanted to go from one side of the block to the other, you could either walk all the way around using the sidewalks, or you could cut straight through the park and save several minutes. Everyone in the neighborhood used it that way. I had walked across that park hundreds of times growing up, both during the day and at night. One of my close friends lived just beyond the park, only about a block away from my house if you took that shortcut. Because of that, I spent a lot of evenings at his place. We'd play video games, watch movies, or sometimes just sit around talking about school, girls, and whatever else seemed important when you're 16 years old. One weekend night in particular stands out in my memory more clearly than almost anything else from that time in my life. My friend had invited a bunch of us over for a poker game. It wasn't anything serious. None of us were gambling big money or anything like that. It was mostly just an excuse to stay up late, eat junk food, and pretend we were professional card players while joking around with each other. His basement was the perfect place for it. There was a big table down there that we used for cards, along with a couch and a television that was always on in the background. The room smelled like pizza, soda, and that slightly dusty basement air that many houses seem to have. The game started earlier in the evening, and at first it was loud and chaotic. Everyone was talking at once, laughing, bluffing, and accusing each other of cheating, even though we were mostly just guessing at what we were doing. As the night went on, though, people started getting knocked out of the game one by one. I ended up losing my chips earlier than I expected, so I spent the rest of the time sitting on the couch watching the others play and occasionally making sarcastic comments about their terrible poker strategies. Time passed quickly. Before we knew it, it was already the middle of the night. The game kept going longer than anyone had planned. People were determined to keep playing until someone finally won the entire pile of chips. Since I was already out, I didn't really care how long it lasted. Around 3 in the morning, my phone rang. It was my dad. When I answered, he told me it was time to come home. Even though my friend only lived a short distance away, my parents didn't like the idea of me staying out all night. Since I was already out of the poker game anyway, I didn't argue. I said goodbye to everyone, grabbed my jacket, and headed out the front door. The neighborhood was completely quiet. At that hour, almost everyone was asleep. The streetlights cast those pale yellow circles of light on the pavement, and the houses all looked dark and still. I started walking toward the park like I always did. The air was cool, and the silence of the night felt almost peaceful. I had taken that same route so many times that I wasn't thinking about it at all. My mind was still replaying moments from the poker game and the jokes my friends had been making earlier. When I reached the edge of the park, I stepped off the sidewalk and began walking across the grass. The playground area sat toward the center of the park. It had a small swing set, a slide, and a few pieces of metal climbing equipment that had probably been there for decades. Usually at night, that part of the park was completely empty. But that night, something was different. As I walked across the grass, I suddenly heard a scream. It was high-pitched and sharp. For a split second, it sounded like the scream of a little girl. The sound immediately made me stop walking. I turned my head toward the playground area, trying to figure out where it had come from. That was when I saw her. There was a little girl sitting on one of the swings. She looked very small, maybe around 4 years old. She was wearing what looked like a white dress, and she was gently swinging back and forth in the darkness. At first, the sight didn't seem creepy to me. My first thought was that maybe a family lived nearby and their child had wandered into the park for some reason. Kids sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and do strange things. But then another thought hit me. It was 3 a.m. What would a 4-year-old child be doing alone in a park at that time of night? I slowed my steps and just stood there watching for a moment. My mind started debating what I should do. Part of me thought maybe I should walk over and make sure she was okay. If she was lost or scared, maybe I could help her get home. But something about the situation didn't feel right. The park was silent except for the faint creaking sound of the swing chains moving back and forth. The girl suddenly stopped swinging. She stepped off the swing and turned to face me. Even in the dim light, I could tell she was looking directly at me. Then she shouted something. "Come, push me." The way she said it sent a strange chill through me. It wasn't the words themselves that were scary. It was the tone. There was something about it that felt aggressive and demanding rather than the way a normal child might ask for help. My instincts told me not to go any closer. Instead, I slowly started backing away. As I turned to leave, the girl suddenly screamed again. "I said, come push me!" The voice echoed across the empty park. Before I could even process what was happening, she started running toward me. That was the moment when my brain switched fully into panic mode. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted across the grass, out of the park, and toward my street as fast as I could. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it might explode. When I reached my street, I quickly ran to the side of my house and crouched down in the darkness near the wall. I stayed completely still, trying to catch my breath. From that hiding spot, I could see the road that ran past my house. A few seconds later, I saw her. The little girl had followed me all the way out of the park. She was standing in the middle of the road. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and her small figure looked even stranger standing there alone. Then she shouted again, "Ready or not, here I come." Hearing that made my stomach drop. I was crouched in the darkness beside my house, barely breathing, terrified that she might spot me. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. For several seconds, she just stood there in the middle of the road. Then something even stranger happened. Out of nowhere, another little girl appeared. I have no idea where she came from. One moment, the first girl was standing there alone, and the next moment, there was another small figure beside her. The second girl walked up to her and grabbed her hand. Then, without saying anything else, the two of them started skipping back down the street toward the park, just like two normal children playing together. I waited until they disappeared into the darkness before I moved again. Then I ran straight to my front door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it, and slipped inside the house. I went straight to my room and got into bed, but I didn't sleep very well that night. My mind kept replaying the image of that girl standing in the road and shouting into the darkness. After that night, I never walked through that park in the middle of the night again. Not once. Now that I'm older and I drive everywhere, I don't need to use that shortcut anymore anyway. And honestly, I'm perfectly fine with that. Because no matter how many times I try to rationalize what happened, the memory of that little girl in the white dress running toward me at 3 in the morning still sends a chill down my spine. Some places just stop feeling safe after a certain moment. And for me, that park became one of those places forever. One afternoon not too long ago, I was walking my son back to his mother's apartment after we had spent some time at the park together. It was one of those ordinary days that parents experience all the time. The weather was nice, the park had been lively with kids running around, and my son had been in a great mood the entire time. He was still small enough that I pushed him in a stroller when we went out for longer walks. That stage of childhood is actually one of my favorite memories now, because everything around them seems exciting. My son would constantly point at things and shout out what he saw. Birds flying across the sky, squirrels running up trees, dogs being walked down the sidewalk. Everything was fascinating to him. As we left the park and started heading back toward the apartment buildings where his mom lived, he continued pointing things out from the stroller. He would spot a pigeon on the ground or a small dog walking past and immediately start calling my attention to it. I remember smiling and talking back to him about each little thing he noticed. Those small moments are some of the best parts of being a parent. Even a simple walk down the street becomes an adventure when you're seeing the world through the eyes of a child. The route back to the apartment building took us past a row of other apartments that lined the street. They were older buildings, the kind with small patches of grass out front and narrow sidewalks running alongside them. People often sat outside in the afternoons, sometimes on steps or folding chairs, just enjoying the fresh air. As we were walking along the sidewalk, I noticed someone sitting ahead of us. It was a man in a wheelchair. At first, there was nothing particularly strange about that. People in wheelchairs weren't uncommon in the area, and the sidewalks were wide enough to accommodate them easily. But as we got closer, I noticed that this wheelchair looked slightly different from the standard ones you usually see. It appeared to be a special needs wheelchair. Across the man's lap, there was a flat board attached to the arms of the chair, almost like a small table. It looked like the kind of setup designed for someone who might need extra support or a place to rest things in front of them. The man was positioned with his back toward the street, meaning that if he wanted to see someone approaching from the sidewalk, he had to turn his head to the right. As we approached, he turned his head in our direction. That was when I really saw his face. Something about his appearance immediately caught my attention. I don't mean that in a cruel way. It was just one of those moments where someone looks so unusual that you can't help but notice. He was bald, completely bald, with very pale skin that almost seemed unnaturally pasty in the afternoon light. His build was short and squat, giving him a somewhat unusual shape as he sat in the chair. For a brief second, my mind tried to place what he reminded me of. The closest comparison that popped into my head was a very strange one. He reminded me of that unsettling figure from the movie The Passion of the Christ, the small, pale creature carried by the devil during the scene where Jesus is being whipped. It wasn't a pleasant comparison, but the resemblance struck me immediately. Still, and I'm generally someone who tries to be polite to people, especially strangers you encounter in passing. As we got closer, the man noticed us looking in his direction. So I did what I normally do when passing someone on the sidewalk. I smiled slightly. The kind of simple, friendly acknowledgement you give when you're walking by another person. At that moment, I noticed something else. His lips were moving. At first, I couldn't hear what he was saying, so I leaned my head slightly closer as we passed by, assuming maybe he had said hello or was trying to speak to me. Then he lifted his hand. His fingers were short and thick, almost stubbly looking. Slowly, very deliberately, he raised his middle finger, and in a low, whispering voice, he said something. "Fuck you. Fuck you. Fuck you." He repeated it several times. The way he said it wasn't loud or angry. That was actually the part that made it feel so strange. It was quiet, almost casual, like he was simply stating something matter-of-fact. He kept nodding his head slightly as he spoke, almost like he was agreeing with himself. "Fuck you. Fuck you." I remember feeling a mixture of confusion and discomfort. My first thought was that the man must have been dealing with some serious mental health issues. People sometimes behave unpredictably when they are struggling. And I tried not to take the words personally, but at the same time, I didn't want my son hearing that kind of language. I glanced down at him quickly, expecting him to be staring at the man or reacting in some way, but he wasn't. My son was still looking around at the trees and birds, completely unaware of what was happening beside us. It was almost as if he didn't even notice the man at all. That struck me as odd. Children usually notice everything, but my son didn't look toward the wheelchair once. I thought briefly about saying something to the man, maybe asking him not to curse in front of a child. But the situation felt strange enough that I decided it would be better to just keep walking. As we passed him, I kept glancing back toward him, partly out of curiosity and partly to make sure nothing else unusual happened. That was when I noticed something disturbing. On his left cheek, there were two thin streaks of blood. They looked like scratches that had been dug into the skin, maybe from fingernails or something sharp. The lines ran down his cheek, and it started to dry slightly. He continued whispering under his breath, "Fuck you. Fuck you." Hearing that again made me quicken my pace slightly. I pushed the stroller faster down the sidewalk, eager to get my son home and away from the situation. The entire encounter had left me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite explain. When we reached the apartment building, I took my son inside and made sure he was settled safely. But the strange image of the man in the wheelchair stayed in my mind. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. If someone was truly in that condition, sitting alone outside like that without any caretaker or supervision seemed unusual, especially with the visible scratches on his face. After a few minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped back outside and walked down the street to the spot where I had seen him. But when I reached the place, he was gone. The sidewalk was completely empty. No wheelchair. No man. No sign that anyone had been sitting there at all. Only about 5 minutes had passed since I had walked by him. I looked around for any indication of where he might have gone. I expected maybe someone had come out of one of the apartments to bring him inside. But there were no open doors, no cars pulling away, no caretakers nearby apologizing or explaining anything. Just a quiet sidewalk in front of the apartment buildings. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. Then eventually I walked back home. Even now, that brief encounter sticks in my mind. I've never seen that man again. And I've never seen anyone who looked remotely like him in that neighborhood since. Something about the entire moment felt surreal. Almost like catching a glimpse of something that didn't quite belong there. And every once in a while, the memory pops back into my head. leaving me with that same strange feeling I had walking away from him on the sidewalk that day. Last summer, I had one of the strangest nights I can remember, and even now I still don't know what to make of it. At the time, I was working a job that occasionally required staying late to deal with system problems when things broke after normal hours. Most of the time, those late nights weren't too bad. The building was quiet, and once I focused on the work in front of me, the hours usually passed without much excitement. But that particular night felt different from the beginning. It was sometime in mid to late July. I had stayed late because something in the system needed fixing, and it was easier to work on it after everyone else had gone home. By the time the evening turned into night, the office was completely empty. Every other employee had left hours earlier, and the entire building belonged to me for the time being. Normally, that might sound peaceful, but this building had a strange atmosphere after dark. During the day, it was just a normal office space filled with people typing at computers, talking in the hallways, and occasionally laughing over coffee in the break room. But once night came and the building emptied out, it seemed to take on a completely different personality. The HVAC system in the building was old and noisy. When it kicked on or adjusted airflow, it produced all kinds of strange sounds. There were squeals, hissing noises, and occasional metallic bangs that echoed faintly through the ventilation ducts. Sometimes you could even feel vibrations in the floor when the system started up again. On top of that, the building itself would make odd cracking noises as the temperature changed during the night. The walls seemed to shift slightly as the airflow moved through the vents. During the day, those sounds blended into the background noise of a busy office. At night, when everything else was silent, they sounded much more unsettling. Another thing that didn't help was the building's location. The office sat in a somewhat secluded area, not surrounded by other busy businesses or crowded streets. Once night fell, there weren't many people around. That thought kept creeping into my mind while I worked. If someone really wanted to break into the building late at night, there probably wouldn't be anyone nearby to notice. My imagination started wandering into all kinds of worst-case scenarios. Every random sound made me jump a little in my chair. I tried to focus on my computer screen and ignore the noises around me, but it wasn't easy. The longer the night went on, the more aware I became of every creak and hiss in the building. Eventually, it was well past midnight. I was sitting at my desk, still working through the issue I'd been assigned to fix. The office lights were on, but outside the windows, everything was completely dark except for the faint glow from the parking lot lights. The blinds over the windows were pulled down. We usually kept them closed when someone worked after hours, so the building didn't draw attention from outside. From the outside, it would just look like a dark office building with no one inside. At some point, while I was trying to concentrate on the problem in front of me, I heard something that didn't sound like part of the building. It sounded like voices. At first, I assumed there were people walking past outside. Maybe someone taking a late-night walk or a couple of people cutting through the parking lot on their way somewhere. That wouldn't have been too strange. But as I listened more carefully, something about the voices felt wrong. They didn't sound like normal conversation. I could hear the rhythm of someone speaking, but I couldn't understand a single word. It wasn't just that they were speaking quietly. The sounds themselves didn't seem like normal speech. It almost sounded like a stream of noise that resembled language but wasn't quite clear enough to recognize. For a moment, I wondered if it might be someone speaking a language I didn't know. But even then, something about the tone and pattern of the sounds made me uneasy. While I was still trying to make sense of what I was hearing, another noise joined the voices. It sounded like rocks being moved around outside. Right beneath the window near my desk, there was a section of landscaping filled with small decorative stones. The noise I heard sounded exactly like someone shifting those stones around with their feet or hands. At that point, my heart rate started climbing. I sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to walk over to the window and look outside. Another part of me thought it might be safer to turn off the lights and pretend no one was in the building. I remember sitting there almost frozen, trying to decide which option felt less terrifying. Eventually, curiosity won. I quietly turned off the office lights so whoever was outside wouldn't easily see me. Then I stood up and slowly moved toward the window. The blinds were still down, so I gently parted them just enough to peek through the gap. What I saw on the other side nearly stopped my heart. A small face was pressed directly against the glass. It was the face of a toddler. The child's nose and forehead were flattened slightly against the window, and their eyes were staring straight inside, as if they were trying to see what was happening in the dark office. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain was struggling to process what I was looking at. The child looked extremely young, maybe 2 or 3 years old. Far too young to be wandering around outside alone in the middle of the night. My first thought was simply confusion. What was a toddler doing outside a dark office building at this hour? I stayed completely still, unsure if the child could see me through the glass. Since I had turned the lights off inside the office, the outside lights probably made it difficult for them to see much inside. Still, I didn't know how long they had been standing there before I looked. After a few seconds, I worked up the courage to open the blinds a little wider. The child was still there, still staring into the window. I stood a few feet back from the glass, unsure what the right move was. Should I open the door and go outside? Should I try to talk to the child through the window? I didn't even know if the child was alone, or if an adult was nearby. Then suddenly, the child turned their head slightly, as if someone had called their name from somewhere in the distance. Without warning, they pushed away from the window and ran. I watched as the small figure hurried across the area outside the building and disappeared toward the parking lot. I rushed to the window and looked out, trying to see where the child had gone. But within seconds, they were gone. The parking lot looked completely empty. I stood there for several moments, scanning the area, but I couldn't see anyone. Not the child, not a parent. No one. At that point, I was still too shaken to go outside by myself to investigate. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called 911. I explained that I had just seen what appeared to be a very young child outside my office building after midnight, and that I was concerned they might be lost. The dispatcher listened carefully and took the information seriously. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. The call came from a restricted number. For a brief second, that startled me, but when I answered, it turned out to be someone from the police department following up on my report. They told me that there had been no reports of missing children in the area that night, but they would send an officer to check around the building just in case. They also said there was nothing more I needed to do. By that point, I was too shaken to keep working. It was close to 1 in the morning, and my nerves were completely shot. I shut down my computer, locked up the office, and headed home. The drive home felt strangely quiet. My mind kept replaying the image of that small face pressed against the glass. When I got home, I tried to sleep, but the whole situation kept running through my head. The next day, I checked several local news websites, expecting maybe to see a story about a missing child or some kind of incident in the area. There was nothing. I even looked through the online police logs for the next 30 days, searching for any reports involving missing children, abuse cases, or anything similar. Still nothing. No one ever reported a missing toddler in that area that night. No follow-up story ever appeared. To this day, I still don't know who that child was or why they were outside my office window after midnight. The memory of that small face staring through the glass still sticks with me. And sometimes I still wonder what exactly I saw that night. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.